All right, good evening or good afternoon or good night, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to Crazy Talk. If this is your first time watching Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV show where I interview all sorts of people about all sorts of things related to mental health. I am your host, Lee Thomas. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, thank you so much for coming back. I'm really glad we haven't scared you off, and we absolutely love the people who tune into the show every week, and it's always great to hear your feedback. So if you have feedback, absolutely please leave it in the comment section, regardless of whether you're watching us live with us right now, or if you're watching the replay. We always love to hear from you. So I'm really excited for this week because we are being rejoined by Brian Cardoza, who is just this amazing advocate. And he was on an episode of Crazy Talk earlier this year, and I put a link to that episode in the comments. And so we become a superhero, writes adult Brian Cardoza in a letter to his 6-year-old self. We are a mighty little one, and we are brave. Brian suffered repeated sexual assault and physical abuse as a child. He left home at the age of 15, nearly freezing to death the first night on his own. Brian knows the trauma and despair victims must overcome to survive. He not only chose to survive, he chose to give voice to an unspeakable topic and to challenge the stigma and shame often associated with male survivors of abuse. Now an inspirational speaker, author, and artist, Brian's message is one of responsibility and hope, and he works diligently to raise awareness and money to fight against childhood sexual assault and physical abuse. A believer in the potential to change, Brian's motto, "Don't let this moment dictate the next moment," is familiar to many he inspires. Brian and his story are featured in a number of national and international projects, including a documentary for the EU, Forced, Promise Place's documentary Ripple Effects, the Bristlecone Project, and Huffington Post's HuffPost Live segment for Child Abuse Awareness Month. He has been a contributing poet for Purple Sparks and a keynote speaker for a multitude of events highlighting abuse. And he's a certified OVC TTAC consultant and RAIN speaker. Brian's love for art began with drawing as a child. He experimented with different mediums from charcoal to stone sculpting. Stopping for a number of years to focus on culinary endeavors, Brian picked art back up at a time when he felt most alone. Today, Brian's art takes various forms, including magnificently colored, refurbished bicycles that he donates to children. He's passionate about learning new techniques and styles, and the creative process continues to heal the child within. Brian founded the Broken Knee Club, a nonprofit organization created to provide a safe haven for all sexes to comfortably speak out about their experience of childhood and adult sexual assault. In collaboration with others, Brian is building Survivor Nights, a community healing through creative expression. Survivor Nights exhibits highlight the enormity of the journey from trauma to healing through dark and bright works of art. Brian's words of encouragement to survivors: your darkest moments may be the light for another. Thank you so much for coming back on the show, Brian. It's always good to have you.
High five, high five, high five.
High fives all around. I love it.
Slap hands, slap hands.
So, Brian, you were telling me before we jumped on the show about the Good Men Project and how you're doing. It's an article every day for a month. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the one, I don't know which one you had read that you had read before, but what I'm doing now is I had it was really kind of a cool story because like the book I wrote, The Unexpected Victim, it's not a number one bestseller or anything like that. So I don't know if you've ever had any experience with it. Like you put your heart and soul into something, then all of a sudden it's like, it barely does anything. You start to question your ability to do that. And so I have a friend, Andy Grant, he was just like, hey, I'm the editor of the Good Men Project. Why don't you send in an article and let me know, and I'll let you know if you can write, and we'll run it if we can. So I sent him the article, Lee, and within like 20 minutes later, he sends me this note, and he's just like, oh, no, we're running with this story. And I was like, and so I wrote him back, and I was just like, you wrote me back so quickly, I thought you were going to be like, never touch a keyboard again. You were going to drop it. You know what I mean? And he was just like, no, I read the first 3 sentences, and I knew we were going to run with it. So that got my foot in the door with the Good Men Project. And then recently, they started a writer's challenge where we have to write 31 articles in 31 days. and the articles got to be between, well, they have a minimum of 200, but they're like, but 350 to 500 is better. So you're like, okay, the minimum is 350. So that's what I've been doing for the last couple of days, of just pounding out article after article after article, because as a student yourself, I'm sure you know, writing 350 to 500 words a day is not exactly easy. So
yeah. And you touched on something that I've actually really been struggling with a lot lately, which is that feeling of kind of self-doubt, I guess maybe is the best word for it, where like you put so much kind of heart and soul into something, and then it doesn't necessarily feel like it maybe had the impact that you want it to, or people aren't receiving it the way that you want them to. How do you deal with that?
I dealt with it poorly, I'll be honest. I did a little bit more self-loathing, and I got into the questions of if I'm doing the right things in the right paths. And what was the affirmations for me, Lee, was, granted, I didn't sell hundreds of thousands of copies. The book's only been out for 2 years. But every once in a while, Lee, I'll get a message from somebody that they'll like send me a private message with their hands on my book, and they'll be like, "This book helped me so much." And I'll get one of those, and all the machismo and tattooed bald head, long goatee goes away, and I'm a blubbering little mess in the corner, just like, "Oh, I helped somebody," you know what I mean? And so those are the moments that, if you're fortunate enough to get them, that will keep you going forward, and you have to have a little bit of faith in yourself to know, even if your first time was not as successful as you wanted it to be, there are more people that I'm sorry, I'm rambling, but there's this great quote saying the greatest inventions in the world are in every graveyard in the city. And what that meant to me was, there are people in the world that could have changed the world, but they were too afraid to try, so they died. And I don't want my great novel or my great story to end up in the graveyard, because it could help somebody, you know what I mean? And so that's kind of that attitude, like, I'm not going to die with this. I want to help people.
Yeah. And that compulsion to, like, I think it's in a lot of people who write, where it's like, I have this story, and it's it feels like it's my purpose to kind of get it out. You know what I mean? And it's not always easy to articulate, because I think sometimes, and maybe this is just me, so I'd love to hear your input, but sometimes I feel a bit almost self-centered, in that, like, so much of what I write about is about me and my own experiences and my own thoughts. And so seeing it as this is something I need to give.
Yep.
But a lot of the times, especially people who, have experienced mental health issues and have experienced trauma and all sorts of stuff, we've internalized this idea that maybe we don't have anything to contribute.
Well, yeah. And so two things on that. I completely 100% agree with you on that, because I even got, I still go to therapy on a monthly basis. And I went to my therapist, and Lee, I was just like, am I a narcissist? And my therapist was like, Brian, the sheer fact that you're willing to ask that question says you're not. And I was just like, oh, touche. I'm like, you got me. So I understand that feeling of like, am I speaking about me too much? But the realization is, and this from the mental health field, we can only talk about what we experienced. I can't speak for you, Lee, and I never can speak for you. We may have similar symptoms on similar things, but I can't speak for you. And so the only thing that I can do is I can speak about what I went through and form it in a way for people to say, oh, I understand what he's going through. I understand what he went through, and maybe what he did will help me, which is why I do the Survivors Helping Survivors, is because people are going to hear those shows and they're going to be like, oh, I never tried that. And they'll go to their therapist, and they'll be like, hey, maybe I should try this. And then they'll find out what's worked for them. But it opens up those avenues. And if we don't tell those stories, they're just stoplights at the end of the road,
Yeah. It's when we keep them to ourselves, we're not necessarily necessarily going to help everyone by sharing them, but when we keep them to ourselves, we're not helping anyone.
Exactly. And we're not helping ourselves, you know. And I was at a panel in Raleigh the other last month, and the panel speaker was just like, "So, Brian, why do you do what you do?" And I was just like, "Because I'm the most selfish person in the room." And everybody in the room was just like, "Oh," you know. I was like, because I know that in order for me to reach another level in my recovery and for me to take back my power in my own life, I need to get rid of this. I need to tell you my story. And by telling you my story, I might be helping you. So in essence, I'm the most selfish person in the room because I want to recover, you know. And they were just like, I'm like, now I get that. Like, but that's the truth. So I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, and this is an interesting conversation that I've been having with a number of people who kind of create and tell stories as as their profession, and especially stories where there is kind of that element of, mental health or trauma or just like really difficult experiences. Do you ever make like distinctions between like, this is something that I need to tell people versus this is something I'm actually going to keep for myself? Is that like a process that you go through?
Yeah, so part of what I do is when I'm okay, it's kind of weird. When I'm actually writing, like if I'm writing a story like I'm doing for the Goodman Project now, I'm telling you what I went through. Okay. When I write my poetry, I'm telling you what I am going through. So like there's like my poetry is succinct and I like to think it's poetic, but double language. But anyway, so I like to think it's good poetry, and I've been read a few times and published a few times. But the poetry for me is a distinction between what I went through and what I'm going through. So my poetry for me is very emotional, like I'll be doing a poem and I almost like catch a tear, whereas I can reread my book, The Unexpected Victim, and just be like, yep, that shit happened. You know what I mean? So there is a distinction for me, and some of the stuff I do keep to myself. There are stories in my life that I have decided that as much as they may help people, I think they will hurt me personally, not like, legally or nothing like that. But, maybe one day I'll get to a point in my recovery where I'm just like, blah, there, have it all, And I honestly, I look forward to that day because I know how much of a release it was to write the book. I know how much of a release it is to write the poetry and say it out loud.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's like a really interesting distinction for me, because I think especially probably not exclusively, but in my experience, especially people who kind of do advocacy work like kind of for a living or or full time or are prominent advocates, I think there's this kind of pressure to be authentic. And like, don't get me wrong, I don't think people should be like out here lying or anything. Yeah. But there's this I think the idea is that if you keep any of your story private, then somehow you're not being authentic. And I think that's really unfair to the people doing the advocacy work.
Yeah. Well, it's I had someone reach out to me and they were like, and it was really weird question, and I had to like back up and reread the question and then like reread it again, because the person was like, do you ever get tired of being a fraud? And I was like, excuse me? You know what I mean? And so I questioned it in a very polite and clinical way. And the person then went on to describe the fact that they feel like a fraud because they're advocates and they're still in recovery. And so I was like, oh, okay, I see what you're saying. You weren't asking me if I felt like a fraud. You were asking, when will your fraud, your stage of fraud feel, gone? And I had to explain to this person, like, you're not a fraud. When you're in recovery, all you're saying to yourself is that you have more good days than bad days. That doesn't mean the bad days don't happen. It's just you have more good days than bad days. And then we start to whittle the bad days down to where you have even more good days. But that still means you're in recovery, and that means you can still be an advocate because you have more good days than bad. And that's like me not telling everything about my story, because yes, I can tell you 90% of my story, but 5 and 8% of it, I don't even tell people I'm intimate with, because it still bothers me, you know?
Yeah, and I think that whole idea of like recovery and advocacy can be really, really messy because I
Mhm.
see this a lot in kind of like mental health advocacy circles where some people are like, well, I'm like in kind of a stable point of recovery, so I feel like I can't be an advocate anymore because
Yeah.
like I'm not living that life. And then other
Mhm.
people are saying like I'm not in a stable state of recovery. I'm still actively struggling. And so I
Yeah.
feel like I can't be an advocate because like I don't have my life together. And so it
Yeah.
feels like you can't win.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But, and it's like what I use with my bad math is that you have to be able to look at things sometimes in a linear fashion and be like, you know what? Last month I had 27 good days in a row. And yes, I had 3 bad days, but we know those are going to happen. So we have a plan for them. So we can go forward. But you have to be able to look back, be like, you know what? 27 days of those month, man, I was on point. You know what I mean? And that means when people are struggling to have 2 days in a row, you can be a major advocate for those people. When they're having 14 days in a row, you can be a major advocate for those people, and that's the goal. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and this idea of like tracking days is really interesting to me because it's something that like I did when I was definitely like recovering from my eating disorder, but now in kind of the ongoing maintenance of my other mental health issues, it's I guess not a habit that I have right now, but is that something that like you encourage people to do is like actually physically
Yeah.
track days?
So what I do, did we discuss about my bad math thing last time we talked?
I don't think so. You mentioned it
Okay.
just now, but not like in
Yeah.
depth.
So bad math for me is what really helped me get through everything that's in my book and everything, Lee. And what it was I looked at the sexual abuse, the physical, and the mental abuse, and I looked at them from beginning to end. So, like the sex abuse. So the sex abuse for me was from the time. I'm sorry, I'm going to use a trigger word. I apologize to anybody. If you're feeling triggered right with what I'm about to say, please call 911 or a local emergency. Reach out to Rain. Find somebody you can comfort and talk to. But when I was being raped, I looked at my rape from the beginning of the rape to the end of the rape. When I was being physically abused, with baseball, with broomsticks and wire coat hangers and stuff, from the beginning of the beating to the end of the beating. And when the mental abuse was going on, I looked at it from then to then. And I found out and I realized, Lee, that I was probably raped for about 45 minutes continuous of my life. I was probably beaten for about 3 days continuously of my life. And I went through about 3 months of really hardcore mental and severe abuse. Well, the reason why I call it bad math, Lee, is because that's 45 minutes, 3 days, and 3 months. I might live till I'm 76 years old. I cannot let that small amount of time override 76 years of life. The reality is, it's always going to be part of my life, but I don't have to give it the foothold that I've given it, um, because I'm going to live longer. I'm going to have moments that are so much better than any of the worst moments that I went through. And if I can regulate that and look at that in a mathematical, linear fashion, I can realize, like, yes, I went through that and it sucks. And I don't want anybody to ever have to go through that again. But I'm going to probably live till I'm 76 years old. So this cannot be greater than the end product. And so when I say look at stuff in a linear fashion, in a day-to-day fashion, that's kind of what I mean. I mean, and now that I'm like, I do daily fasting, I'm even just cut carbs. Look at my life like, okay, today I'm not going to eat carbs, and I'm going to go crazy at noon, and I'm going to go nuts at 3 o'clock. but tomorrow I'm not going to eat carbs again, and that's how I get through those days. It's kind of like doing cardio, where you're like I don't want to do 20 minutes. Okay, it's 18. Okay, just one more minute. Okay, just one more minute, and then you get to 20 and you're done.
Yeah. So breaking it up into kind of those, seeing it as like manageable chunks of time. And I think that takes like a tremendous amount of, I guess, determination maybe is the right word, to be like, I am determined to like focus on the good times and the potential good times and like this much bigger portion of my life, and determined to like not let these events in my life define me.
Yeah, well, it's like in peer support. I am not rape. I am a rape survivor. I am not PTSD. I have PTSD, but I am not PTSD. I have social anxiety, but I am not social anxiety. And so when I look at my life and I look at those things, I'm like, okay, well, you know what? I'm a rape survivor, but I also have blue eyes. You know what I mean? Like, and I can just be like, okay, so this is just a part of who I am. But in 76 years, I can change everything about myself, and I can help other people change. So I'm not going to focus in on this. I'm going to focus in on this. And, and that's the way I get through. So.
Yeah, and kind of intentionally, I remember there was a quote that I think one of my coworkers when I was like in high school talked about, and it was the whole like if you turn your face to the light, you can't see the shadows. It was something along those lines.
Yeah, that's kind of cool. That's cool. That's a cool one. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely like quotes are great. I definitely think there's like a balance where like you can see the light and also recognize the shadows. Like I don't think it's an either or thing, but that's really what that reminded me of. I think that's terrific.
Yeah, I mean, and that also is kind of like, let's live blind by choice. Let's not do that. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you can't focus in on potential versus expected. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, and that's always a struggle for people. And I realize that at my age and at my level of recovery, not everybody's there. You know what I mean? And I don't expect people to be there. I want them to get there. I desperately fight for them to be there. But they'll get there when they get there, and that's the expectation, is that, you may not be ready to achieve what I've achieved at this moment. Tomorrow's a different day, and I've seen people overnight change, and just all of a sudden something clicks and you're just like, done. You know what I mean? And that's a beautiful thing. I'm sorry, I'm gonna be a little narcissistic here. When we were in the pre-thing, you had said you were talking about a quote or something from the article I wrote, and we're running up on time, so I'm really curious to what you thought, what you wrote out.
Yes. So it was, what stood out to me was when you said, "What can we as a society do to help the brave ones who haven't come forward yet?" And I just really wanted to hear kind of your thoughts on that.
So what I think we can do is that first, we as a society have to acknowledge that this is not a gender or a woman's issue, that it's actually a humanitarian issue. So we have to accept that both genders are rapists and are victims. Now, I mean, at no point in time am I trying to mitigate, Lee, that men have the lion's share of the atrocities. But we still have to speak about both and realize that men are victims and so are women. And we have to acknowledge that. The minute we start to acknowledge that, we will start to develop open spaces for people to come and talk. I did an interview once, and I said, and I looked at the guy, and I was like, "Lee, if you opened a restaurant, would you ever sell people lentils and tree bark?"
No,
because nobody's asking for that, right? But if all of a sudden we go on this craze and people are asking for lentils and tree bark, and you have a great recipe, you open a restaurant, right?
Yes.
So the analogy is, if men aren't reporting, why are people going to delegate resources and things to that for them to have those spaces? Because men don't report. But if we open it up and let men report, let the need evolve, let the need come out, then we'll start getting those resources. We'll start getting the places where men can feel safe to open up about this. And then as men feel safe to open up, then people realize, like, holy crap, this can happen to anybody. And then we start to do stuff. You know what I mean? Because as long as we have the ability to go, oh no, that just happens to them, we're never gonna do anything about it. That's the number one procrastinator trick in the world. Like, oh no, that's that over there. We have to realize it's us, and we realize that it's a humanitarian issue, and we have to realize that it's, it costs trillions of dollars every year to treat victims of sex abuse because of the addiction rates, the arrest rates, the overdose rates. You know what I mean? Like, and until we realize that, we're going to be a society that always puts it off on something else. And we as a society need to ask ourselves, what are the questions we can do? And that is make it an open space for people to come and talk.
Yeah. And that definitely, I mean, we see something similar in like the eating disorder field where it ends up being this kind of catch-22 where it's like, we only create spaces where certain people feel safe to talk about it. And then we think that those are the only people who experience it. Right. And we see that with eating disorders as well, where eating disorder spaces are like overwhelmingly, like cisgender, white, heterosexual women. And we know that that's not the only population that experiences eating disorders, but because like that's kind of the population that's been studied and like had the spaces created for them, we don't see like reporting and treatment levels as much in other populations because of that whole like, again, that catch-22 where it's like, if we pretend they're not there, then they won't be there.
Yeah. Well, it's like the realization that rape numbers in lesbian relationships are just as high as heterosexual relationships. But we don't talk about that. You know what I mean? Like, oh, no. Like, but we need to talk about that. We need to have those conversations because the more we realize that this is far reaching, like you said, when we only delegate money to one certain group of people with eating disorders, the other ones don't exist because like, oh no, we don't have, there's 3 of them. No, there's 30 million. You know what I mean? And we need to start, we need to start working on men with eating disorders. We need to start working on these things to show that our humanity is more important than our individuality.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And thank you so much, Brian, for being on the show. Our half hour goes by so fast. It's wild. I just absolutely love chatting with you. So for the folks who are watching the show and going like, Brian is amazing, where can I, find out more about his work? Where would you like people to go?
Well, if they're thinking that I'm amazing, I would ask them to go to their therapist or their and get some stuff checked out. Well, if they want to find me, they can find me at Brian Cardoza on Facebook. They can also go to Survivor Nights, which is my traveling art show. We have a couple good shows coming up where Survivor Nights is, we don't care what you survived, we just care that you did. And so we have a great art show, great spoken word. They can find me on Survivor Nights. They can find me at brian-cardoza.com. And even honestly, I always joke around on this, but you can even find me on Plenty of Fish as Brian Cardoza.
Lots of ways to find you on the internet. I'm in the same boat.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Brian. It's always a pleasure. I just love chatting with you. And I think the work that you're doing is absolutely so important.
Same at you. Thank you. And thank you for giving us the space, Lee.
Thank you.
Not too many people have the courage to do so. And so thank you again.
Oh, I appreciate that. So for those of you who are tuning into the show and going like, wow, Crazy Talk is so much fun. I want to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox. You can do that by signing up for my mailing list at leethomas.ca. And I will also put a link in the comments below. Thank you again, Brian, for tuning in. Oh,
I forgot to say, if you want my book, The Unexpected Victim, it's on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
Okay, fabulous. And I will put links to everything Brian mentioned in the comments below as well, a couple minutes after the end of the show. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we will see you next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Bye, guys.